Welcome back to the KDPG Sunday Edition. I'm John Delano. Our guest is Jim Rooney, author of the new book about his father called A Different Way to Win, Dan Rooney's story from the Super Bowl to the Rooney Rule. And I'm also joined by Jerry Micco from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Jim, you know, of course, my forte, unlike Jerry's, he knows sports better than anybody, I'll tell you. But my forte is politics and government. Your dad always had an interest in public affairs, and I've known him for over 40 years. And every time I talked to him, and it was a lot, it was always about something else besides football. And I always appreciated the fact that this was a cosmopolitan gentleman, a man who was way beyond a simple sports scene. So I want to talk a little bit about that because I think his Irish roots, your family's Irish roots, I guess we all have Irish in us, but his and your Irish roots really meant so much to him when it came to what was going on in Ireland and Northern Ireland. Can you talk to us a little bit about the growth of the development of his interests in the conflicts that were going on, the so-called Troubles?
Sure. So you know, John, as you mentioned, the Rooneys left Ireland in 1849. I won't go back that far, but you know, you
got a little bit of history in
there.
Got
a little bit of history in there. So you had really 50 years of our family going back and forth and dealing with a lot of the traditional struggles of that time of immigrant families. And you had, you know, both my great-grandfather and his father, I don't know how many greats you go back there, lost their jobs in the mills here in Western Pennsylvania and struggled deeply. You had all of the issues that you have with, you know, I think we now will call it depression and you know, a whole lot of probably dysfunction that folks that I think suffered in those ways faced in a particularly challenging way. And then you had my grandfather who sort of made it, and he made it because he was a great athlete and a pretty good promoter. So then it comes to my father to sort of try to establish that and make that something that can last more than maybe one generation. So doing things a certain way and creating legitimacy and establishing processes and procedures meant a lot to him. Certainly we talk about it in the football side, and you know, Jerry talked about how the Steelers became good, but my father really felt that society needed those things, and you needed, you know, you needed to be effective, you needed to have, you know, policies and practices that would help people, that would give people the opportunity where you could, you know, the fairness would come about, and those things weren't happening in Ireland. If you look at what my father thought of Northern Ireland when he first started going over, he compared it to the civil rights issues here in America because we think of it as this religious conflict. But it was playing out in housing discrimination, it was playing out in job discrimination, it was playing out in the ability to get capital if you were going to start a business. So all of those things, there was one group, in this case mainly the Catholics, that were suffering, and he felt like some of the approaches that were being considered here should be considered in Northern Ireland.
Well, just to refresh everybody's memory, we're the island of Ireland, 32 counties, but 26 of them are under Irish independent rule since the early 1920s. 6 counties are part of the United Kingdom. They're Northern Ireland. They're part of Great Britain, essentially the part of the British country. And the playing...
Thanks, John. Coming from where we come from, I assume that's everyone understands that, but I'm glad you explained that.
Well,
not everyone knows that.
Not everybody is Irish. My ancestry, some of it is actually from Northern Ireland, and that's where your family was from.
Right. The Rooneys are from Newry, which is a border town.
Exactly. South, I guess south of Belfast area.
Right, just south of Belfast and just north of Dublin. They're actually almost right in between Dublin and Belfast.
So there were 2 ways to resolve this. There were those, the IRA, who felt that using violence and you know, killing Lord Mountbatten and others was a mechanism to try to bring this country back together again. And then there were others like your dad, who had the Martin Luther King approach, I think is what your book would describe. So tell us what he did that made a difference.
Right. So, you know, I think there was a lot of money coming from the United States to Ireland, and most of that money, you know, prior to maybe the mid-70s was going to things that would enhance the violence
Guns and
ammunition,
bombs
those
and the
types of
like,
things.
right.
And look, certainly we all understood that those folks were very passionate. They felt like they were freedom fighters. My father didn't disagree with some of their assessment of the problem. He just thought that that was the wrong solution. He thought that dialogue and building capacity and infrastructure would be a better way. So he and Tony O'Reilly, who was the great chairman and CEO of Heinz, came to Pittsburgh, I think in '74. They created an organization called the American Ireland Fund. And the fund got very involved in the peace process, which is unusual for a charity. And they really supported the SDLP, which is a political party a gentleman named John Hume led. And John is considered the Martin Luther King or the Gandhi of the peace process. And
won a Nobel Peace Prize.
Won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1996. And so they invited John Hume, Seamus Mallon, who was one of Hume's acolytes, to a bunch of these events, and they would speak about, look, here's the problems, and they would get into detail, as I said, that the schools, the integration of the schools was you were just getting a much poorer education if you were Catholic versus Protestant. So how can we start funding education to bring people up to speed? They invested in a whole bunch of incubators, and so for, there were time periods and caps on all of these, but once you got to a certain level, you had to have 50% Catholic, 50% Protestant in your workforce. In terms of lending, they were trying to create lending where you would get lending mechanisms from both Catholic and Protestant or banks.
It's something to go from being an owner of an NFL team to being an ambassador in the political world. But your dad was one of those people who obviously could do that. When did he get a sense that that might be coming? And I know he supported Barack Obama early on, but when did he get a sense, and did he talk to all of you about it before he did it?
Well, so Eric Holder, who we've mentioned, was became the Attorney General under President Obama, and Eric had been one of the NFL's lawyers, and so we had some conversations about this. Art and I, my brother Art and I, and we foolishly thought, we all talked about this being a retirement job, and there would be a nice sort of capstone. And so my father goes to Ireland as ambassador. He's, March 17th, 2009, President Obama nominated him, St. Patrick's Day. And he goes over to Ireland, and everyone you talked to at Embassy Dublin loved working for him, but they said, look, this was not a guy who was over there golfing on vacation. The projects tripled. And some of them, the peace process still needs some attention. So some of them dealt with peace. Some of them dealt with a new type of integration. So Ireland in 1970, I think, had less than 7,000 Muslims. Now you're at I think it's like 12% of the country. Sorry, but he had these luncheons for interfaith luncheons. So he did things that were, I think, pretty substantial as ambassador.
And he made a commitment to go to all 32 counties.
All 32 counties.
26 in the Republic, and also the 6 counties that were in a so-called other country.
Right, and it's interesting because we think of that, it was a nice thing to do, but it really became, this guy who was 78, 80 while he was ambassador, became the model for the ambassadors, because the United States, like I think the rest of the world, is trying to switch from sort of traditional diplomacy where everything's done behind closed doors to what they call public diplomacy, where the ambassadors are supposed to get out into the country and build a relationship between the United States, the image of the United States and the people of that country. And so Dan Rooney, who's the oldest guy, is carrying out this sort of new policy that they're trying to implement.
Right. We have run out of time. We could go on forever on so much of this. The book is called A Different Way to Win. Highly recommended. It would be a great Christmas gift for anybody. We'll be back in a moment when the Sunday edition continues. Stick with us.